Mr Speaker.
Call Kamal Sepuloni.
Mr Speaker, I'm standing up on behalf of Labor to say that at this stage we support the bill, but we do have major reservations, and those reservations are based on the evidence that we've had put before us. I do want to address something that was said by another member in the House, and that is that anyone that might oppose this bill isn't putting children at the centre of the debate. And, Mr Speaker, I think that is incredibly unfair. I think no one in this House can say that there's any party or any individual that doesn't care about the welfare of children, and in this case in relation to sexual offences against children. There is no one in this House that doesn't care about that. And our job here, Mr Speaker, is to be rational in our thinking, to use evidence to guide our decision making, because it is so easy to be guided by emotion, Mr Speaker. This is an emotional issue. This is an emotional issue for us in this House. This was an emotional issue for the people that came to make a submission. It is an emotional issue for most of the country, actually, Mr Speaker. And so keeping that in mind, we just need to remind ourselves that our job is to make rational decisions on behalf of the country and to use an evidence base to make those decisions. So, of course, we support the intent of the bill, Mr Speaker, and that is to reduce sexual reoffending against child victims and the risk posed by serious child sex offenders by providing government agencies with the information needed to monitor child sex offenders in the community and providing up-to-date information that assists the police to more rapidly resolve cases of child sex offending. I don't think anyone would dispute that. The dispute would come with respect to whether or not we need a child sex offender register to be able to have that kind of data information sharing between government agencies. So many people during this process have felt misled or have been misled in some ways, Mr Speaker, by the fact that this bill says child sex offender register, because the assumption is that this will be a public register, and of course we know that that is not the intention. That is why New Zealand First, who do think it should be a public register, have put up an SOP, or will be putting up an SOP to say that it should be a public register, and that is why we on our side of the House, though, are putting up an SOP to say that it shouldn't be a public register and that there should be no doubt that it isn't a public register. Mr Speaker, one of the concerns that was raised by many of the submitters, and a concern that we now have based on the evidence that we've had put before us, is that a child sex offender register, Mr Speaker, can give a false sense of security. And, you know, giving it some context, I think we need to really look at the wider issue that we have at hand, and that is sexual offending against children, Mr Speaker. And if we look at the most recent stats for New Zealand, we see that 1 in 3 children in New Zealand, girls in New Zealand, will be sexually abused. 1 in 7 boys in New Zealand, Mr Speaker, will be sexually abused. And the sad case, Mr Speaker, is that only 10 out of 100 sexual abuse crimes are actually reported. Only 3 out of 100 sex crimes will actually make it to court, and actually only one out of 100 sexual abuse crimes in this country will actually lead to conviction. So when we're talking about a sexual offender register, we're only talking about the sexual offenders who have actually been convicted that can actually go on that register, Mr Speaker. That's only 1 out of 100 of the sex crimes that happen in this country. And so, Mr Speaker, we're talking about a very small part of a huge issue that we have as a country. A recent stat that I saw as well was that more than 23% of women who participated in a recent Auckland study reported having been sexually abused as children, and most of those women, Mr Speaker, reported that it was a family member that committed the sexual offence. And it makes us all feel very comfortable in this place. It makes us feel all very comfortable in the public as a country, that actually the reality is the people that our children are most likely to be sexually abused by are family members or close friends of family, Mr Speaker. It's not the stranger that we're talking about here. It's certainly not the person who's been convicted of a sexual offence, because so few are actually convicted of a sexual offence. So to give people this false sense of security is concerning, Mr. Speaker. We're not resolving the issues. We're barely making, wouldn't even be making a dent in the problem for these children who are at risk of being sexually offended against by introducing a child sex offender register, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it was raised by several submitters that this register is going to cost a lot of money to actually administer. We're talking about $146 million over 10 years. That's $14 million a year, Mr. Speaker. And the agencies who actually deal with children, with women, with men who have been sexually offended against, those agencies came to us and have said there are better ways to spend that money. There are more effective ways to address this issue. There are more effective ways to spend that money, Mr. Speaker. And that is a very valid point. This is a big chunk of money going towards a tool which evidence tells us will not be effective in stopping sexual abuse against children, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we did have over 100 submissions to this bill, and the ones that I actually was reading up on before I came to the House today were the ones that actually are the people who work in this sector. They are the people who work with children, with adults who have been sexually abused or have had a sexual offence committed against them, Mr. Speaker. And overwhelmingly, those organisations that actually undertake this work, who have committed their lives to working with people who've been sexually offended against, are actually against a child sex offender register, Mr. Speaker, for many reasons, including some of the ones that I've just stated. The cost and the fact that that money could be channelled to more effective measures to stop sexual offending against children. And also, Mr. Speaker, the false sense of security that they're concerned that it will give people. There was some submissions by these organisations that raised the fact that this could actually further serve to isolate the offender and could actually result in the offender being more likely to go on to re-offend, Mr. Speaker. And we have to take those concerns seriously, particularly when they've been raised by organisations, reputable individuals in those organisations who have committed their lives to this work. And I want to quote a couple of them so that we just get an understanding for the thinking that's gone on within these organisations. So we've got one here from the New Zealand Family Violence Clearinghouse. And so, quote from the submission, the vision of the clearinghouse is that families, whānau and relationships are healthy, respectful and free from violence. Our purpose is to provide access to high quality research and information on family and whānau violence. We are committed to working towards the elimination of all forms of family and sexual violence, including child sexual abuse. However, we do not support the establishment of a child sex offender register. This is because there is little to no evidence that registers reduce rates of child sex offending. We believe the high level of resourcing a register would require would be far more effectively spent on initiatives which have evidence of effectiveness. Further information, including references to relevant research and our recommendations, are included in this submission. That's just one of many of the reputable organisations who submitted on this and actually have said to us we need to rethink it. Now, Mr. Speaker, we're at the position where we will support this at this stage through to the next stage. We will have amendments that we want to put up at committee stages, and we really have to think through whether or not we will support this at third reading. We need to know that this is actually going to make a difference in people's lives, that it is actually going to go assist us in reducing sexual offences against children before we can support this particular bill, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much.